right, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. My name is Erica Bond. I'm the Vice President of Justice Initiatives here at John Jay College. Welcome again. Welcome to those who are just joining us this afternoon to this wonderful panel we have for you today on fair and accountable policing for safe communities. At the plenary this morning, John Jay President Carol Mason framed the 4 pillars of safe communities around which we've structured this summit. Communities that are resourced, that are just, that are healthy, and communities that are restored. This panel will focus on the principle that just communities are ones where police have the trust and confidence of the people they serve. We have a wonderful group of panelists here today with a range of experiences with policing and accountability, and they will discuss the importance of building trust, the challenges that communities and individuals face in ensuring fairness and accountability in policing, and the opportunities to improve policing to support just communities. Our moderator this afternoon is Walter Katz. He's the Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. Walter joined Arnold Ventures after more than 2 decades in public service, beginning with a 17-year tenure as a public defender in Southern California, through his 2017 appointment as Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety in the administration of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. At the mayor's office, Walter oversaw one of the most complex police reform efforts in the United States. He served as a co-negotiator of the consent decree that was enacted in 2019, and he also led the design and development of the new Office of Violence Prevention. He worked closely with the police department in developing a new use of force policy and chaired the Crisis Intervention Advisory Committee. He has an extensive background in law enforcement accountability and oversight. He previously served as the independent police auditor for San Jose, California, following his appointment by the City Council in 2015. He's also served as Deputy Inspector General for the County of Los Angeles Office of the Inspector General that oversees the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Thank you, Walter, so much for moderating this panel.
Thank you, Erica. Really appreciate it. And I'm only going to stand for this particular part so I can move the lectern back. And very brief remarks. So folks be able to see me here, sitting over here on the right side. So thanks so much for being here. And I know it's after lunch. If you've ever been in a jury or in class after lunch, I know how hard it can be. So we're going to keep things lively here. And we are here to talk today about the context of safe and just communities and accountability. For police to contribute to public safety, they must be viewed as effective and legitimate by the communities they serve. Building trust between police and communities requires transparency, accountability, and resources. This panel will discuss the challenges communities face in ensuring fairness and accountability in policing and the opportunities to incorporate accountability into community safety strategies. Our goal is that you'll be able to take away usable insights and action steps from today's conversation. So first, let me introduce the panelists with you today. They are a remarkable group from a broad cross-section of work, which I'll let them explain to you what it is that they do and why they do it. So right next to me is Marquez, Marq Claxton, Director of Public Relations and Political Affairs at the Black Law Enforcement Alliance. Next to Marq is Deborah Witzburg, Inspector General for the City of Chicago. To her immediate left is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, Executive Director of the Terence Crutcher Foundation, followed by Heather Warnken, Executive Director of the Center for Criminal and Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore Law School, and last and not least, Smoot, Director and Chief Legal Counsel at the Police Benevolent and Protective Association of Illinois, and as of this year, the chairperson of the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Bureau. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I truly appreciate you joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to start, I'm just going to go in order to start with. Tell the audience about what it is that you do. We heard your titles, and what brought you to this work. That's the most important part. So just take a couple minutes and tell us about what brought you here. Mark, I'll start with you.
Well, great. I'm glad I sat here. I'm currently the director of Black Law Enforcement Alliance. I do public affairs and political relations for the organization. I'm a retired NYPD detective. I'm the former co-founder of an organization very well known in this city, in large part due to the current mayor, 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. What brought me to this work was my life's experience and being this young black boy growing up in Brooklyn in this city and maturing in the 60s and the 70s and having repeated interactions with police that very few of them were favorable or nice or polite or decent or respectable, and forming an opinion of what police were and how police were. And then moving on into my young adult space in the 70s and 80s, and being encouraged by my mother, who thought a career in policing was a good way to get a pension. And that was the initial motivation for me going to the police department. I took the test at the insistence of my mother. I did not trust the police. I did not have positive experiences with police as a young black boy in Brooklyn and in Queens. And ultimately, I joined the police department, had a very successful career, got to work with some amazing individuals, realized that there's a poisonous element in police, but more importantly, there's a culture of policing that works against the very interest of justice. And that's a disturbing reality to get with. And that's why I ended up joining these organizations that, while working in the police department, we spoke out very boldly while employed by the city of New York, spoke out against all issues involving the injustice in this city and the behavior, the abhorrent behavior of the NYPD, and also speaking about national issues of police brutality, criminality, and how police agencies are the last ones who are really willing and open to creating and establishing long-term respectful relationships with communities, especially, and this is very important, communities of color. It is a different dynamic with policing and different communities.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it. It's really notable how your origin story tracks so closely to Mayor Adams of what got them to taking the test in the first place.
He is a dear friend of mine to this day, so yeah, there's a lot of similar,
Yep.
There's a lot in our stories that is similar, so yes.
I appreciate that. Deborah, former state prosecutor in Illinois, public safety inspector general. Tell us what you do.
Thank you. The City of Chicago's Office of Inspector General, which I've run for the last year or so, is an independent, nonpartisan watchdog agency within city government. We exercise oversight over all of the operations of Chicago city government. We do that in two ways. We do investigative work to hold individual bad actors accountable when they break the rules, criminal and administrative investigations. And then we also do program and policy work geared toward more effective, efficient operations of city government. And in both of those channels of work, policing and public safety are tremendously high priorities, and that's really a reflection of how large those things loom kind of in the consciousness of Chicagoans. I came to this work, as Walter mentioned, was a Cook County State's attorney, and in that work, I saw this very direct line between the quality of the relationship between the police department and the community and our ability to keep people safe in an effective way. When we were able to successfully prosecute crimes, it was not because a police officer happened to be standing on a street corner to see something bad happen. It was because somebody trusted a police officer enough to tell them what happened. And so I had this very up-close, real-life lesson in how concrete a relationship that is, the quality of a department's relationship with its community, and how effective we are at public safety. As I was doing that work and sort of giving this some thought, the video of the killing of Laquan McDonald was released in Chicago, and that really sort of touched off a wave of police reform efforts. And the city of Chicago started to get into the business of police oversight and public safety reform in a more serious way. And I felt as though I had sort of seen a view of policing from my seat as a prosecutor that I could bring to bear on the reform work, driven by this notion that public safety reform is not an alternative to public safety, it's a prerequisite to it. And so that is how it came to be.
Thank you so much. Tiffany, we just first started talking last week, but I feel like I've known you forever. And I'm not sure if it's we just got along or also shared history. But I'd love to hear about the work you do, why you do it, and what you've created over the last several years, because I think it's remarkable.
Thank you so much, Walter, and it's definitely an honor to be on this panel. I need all of you all in Oklahoma, because we got a lot of work to do. I don't know if I truly trust the institution of policing, and it's because my twin brother, Terence Crutcher, was killed at the hands of a law enforcement officer named Betty Shelby back in 2016. As we speak right now, my father is in the middle of a deposition because now our civil trial has started to move. 4 years later, this case has been sitting on a judge's desk because of qualified immunity. You know, we went to a criminal trial. She was indicted on first-degree manslaughter charges. For the first time in the history of Tulsa, a police officer had been charged. And you all know the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I am a descendant of a survivor of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where my great-grandmother, Rebecca Brown Crutcher, had to flee in fear of her life, had to flee from state-sanctioned violence from Tulsa's police department. And almost 100 years later, my twin brother, Terence, found himself being murdered by the same state, by the same police department. And we drew really stark parallels between what happened in 1921 when black men were killed indiscriminately with their hands in the air. No repair, no respect, no restitution until this day. And here I am right now fighting the same institution. There's been no justice. We believe that the verdict came out and it was a major miscarriage of justice. She was acquitted after 9 hours of deliberation. And what was interesting with this verdict that was rendered was that the jury penned a letter to the verdict stating that they didn't believe that she was blameless and that she should never be a patrol officer again. But because of the way the laws are written, we have to render this verdict. And she was acquitted. And I had to figure out how to turn my pain into purpose. You know, we thought we were getting somewhere. I had to figure out how to turn the anger that I had on the inside of me, Walter, into advocacy, and the trauma into some form of solace, some form of triumph. And so we started the Terence Crutcher Foundation to keep my brother's name alive, because when he was killed, unarmed, with his hands in the air, no weapon, he wasn't under arrest, he wasn't a fleeing felon, he just left school. And she said in her testimony that I thought he was high on something, and Terence did struggle with drug addiction, or I thought he was having a mental health breakdown. And so instead of helping him, he received a bullet. Several other officers, they ran to the scene. He was tased, shot, and tased again. And there was a helicopter looming over the air. All of these police officers, like he was the New York bomber. And the police officer in the helicopter said he looked like a bad dude. Not sure what a bad dude looks like that far up in the air. All I can suspect is that they saw the color of my brother's skin. But what I decided was that I wouldn't let this narrative, and we're going to talk about what we're doing, Walter, but I wouldn't let hate, racism, or bigotry control my brother's story. Terence wasn't a bad dude. He was my twin. He had children who loved him. He was a son. He loved gospel music. He loved to cook. That's who my twin brother was. And so I started this foundation. And I'm, I went to school to be a healthcare practitioner. And now I'm a healthcare practitioner turned social justice practitioner. And my foundation, we advance policy. That's one of the pillars of our work. I had to make a promise to my community that I would transform, not reform, but transform this institution of policing that has plagued so many communities across this country. We strengthen communities, a lot of restorative justice work, youth prevention programs. I'll be here all day talking about what we do in Tulsa, but right there in the center of our work, Walter, is that we honor the legacy of our ancestors, because we can't really fix what's happening current day without grounding our work in history and how the institution of policing started. And so that's why I'm here, and I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Thank you, Tiffany, so much. Really appreciate it. Heather, hi. Heather, you're doing some remarkable work in Baltimore, and before that, many different places around the country. Introduce yourself. Tell everybody what you do and what you've created with your colleagues over the last year at Baltimore University.
Thanks, Walter, and thank you. Yeah, it's really, really powerful and tough to follow. I'm really honored to be here on this panel today and to share a little bit more about what we do at the Center for Criminal Justice Reform. We have a twofold mission: to support community-driven efforts to, one, address the harm and inequity caused by the criminal legal system, and two, to advance public safety. And I think this will be a theme. We don't view those goals as in tension. We view them as inextricably linked. And we carry out this mission in a number of different ways, including serving as a convener for critical dialogues. One of the things that brings me to this work and makes my current role just such a dream job is that we're building up our center to be a hub of experiential learning opportunities for law students who are passionate about these issues, to have hands-on roles in this work, and to really do that in multidisciplinary problem-solving ways across systems. So we have a world-class clinical program at our law school where law students are doing direct client services. Our center is complementing that through legislative work, policy reform, really empowering the next generation to use their law degrees to think big and bold about change and transformation. My prior role at the U.S. Department of Justice, I served for 5.5 years as a visiting fellow in the first position focused on bridging the gap between research, policy, and practice to improve our response to crime victims and communities impacted by violence. And I wore a lot of different hats in that role, but one that I'll mention that I think will be relevant to our discussion today. I worked really closely with the Public Safety Partnership Program, and as some of you may know, PSP, that's a large-scale training and technical assistance program run out of the U.S. Department of Justice that works with cities throughout the country on their efforts to reduce violence. And one of the many resources that cities have the opportunity to take advantage of through PSP are these deep dive assessments on different topics related to reducing violent crime. I had the great honor of leading a comprehensive assessment for the city of Baltimore on how victims are treated, focused on how Black and brown victims of gun violence are treated. And there were just so many really difficult revelations in that report that I hope we can talk about today, but it was really based on listening. My team and I did over 50 hours of recorded confidential interviews with law enforcement of various ranks and roles, community-based providers, victim services, to really understand that conversation and those questions from a lot of different angles. So with that, I'll pass it on. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Heather. And Sean, tell us about yourself. I'm especially curious, and the audience would be, about your work on President Obama's task force in 21st century policing, and or whatever else you want to talk about.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Walter, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you, Tiffany. I can't express what I'm sure many have tried to express, how sad I am about the loss of your brother and for you and your family. So please accept that from me. My name's Sean Smoot. I'm an attorney by training. I have a former law enforcement experience. I served as a police commissioner in a small town in central Illinois for 10 years. I've worked as the director and chief counsel for the Police Benevolent Association in the state of Illinois, doing mostly legislative advocacy related to everything from pensions, Walter, to the Safety Act, which was passed pretty wide wide-reaching police reform bill that was passed by our General Assembly a couple of years ago. I also, as Walter mentioned, I've had some incredible opportunities professionally over my career. I served on the executive session on police and public safety at the Harvard's Kennedy School for 6 years. I was honored to serve on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. And at the culmination of the task force work, I formed a company with Chuck Ramsey, who also served as a co-chair on President Obama's task force, and Roberto Villasenor, called 21st Century Policing 21CP Solutions. And our company does consulting work all around the country. We do assessment of police departments, consent decree monitoring. I serve on the monitoring team in Baltimore and Cleveland, and Walter and I work together. I had the opportunity to work together in Seattle on their consent decree, and we do a myriad of other things as well. But really, our company is rooted in the principles that were talked about in the 21st Century Task Force report. Pillar 1, building trust and legitimacy. And so, because apparently he thought I didn't have enough to do, the governor of the state of Illinois, about 2.5 years ago, appointed me to the training board, the Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board for the state of Illinois. And this past December, I was elected to be the chairman of that board by the other board members. It's the most time-consuming, worst possible unpaid job anyone could ever have. I don't recommend it. But it's really important work because, kind of apropos to today's discussion, our training board is currently going through a metamorphosis from being an agency that essentially just approved curriculum of training and set standards in terms of the number of hours of training that police officers would have to now becoming a regulatory agency that has the power to decertify officers, that has the power to investigate allegations of misconduct, and so forth. So, as I said, very time-consuming and probably the worst unpaid job in the world. But
And I've got some ideas to make it even more time-consuming for you. So just buckle your seats. So in the next 45 minutes or so, and thank you, all of you, right? And as you can see from this panel, it's like such a wide-ranging perspective, set of backgrounds and experiences, but notice how perspectives are all pointing towards the same direction, that it's imperative that we change the ways of policing. Now, we're going to start at this optimistic note, right? Hopeful note. We're going to get a little bit dark. We're going to get a little bit real to ask some tough questions with what has changed since 2014? What has changed since 2016 or 2018? I could go way back, right? So we're going to talk about overview of what is accountability. We're going to talk about the challenges, but we're also going to talk about opportunities. And then I've got a bunch of questions that if we have time, I'll hit you with. And then in the last 15 minutes, we're going to open it up to audience questions, all right? So let's start with, what does this thing called accountability actually mean? That word can sometimes feel abstract. It can be defined differently depending on the community or organizations involved. So what is that? What is fair and accountability? What does fair and accountable policing mean to you? I'm not going to go in order, so I'm going to mix it up a bit. So, Sean, I'm going to start with you, since you were last, and ask you, what does accountability mean to you, or fair and accountable policing?
It means to me policing that is subject to procedural justice, both internally within the department and externally, for both the officers and for complainants or victims of misconduct. And it actually, I think we need to hold not only officers and individuals accountable, that I think kind of goes without saying, but we really need to look at system accountability. We don't do enough now, in my opinion, in terms of root cause analysis, actually looking at events that come up with either intentionally horrific or accidentally horrific results, and actually figuring out what happened and how we can prevent it from happening. And if I could just, like, I flew here. How many people flew on a plane to get to this meeting today? How many people took a train? How many took another form of public transportation? The reason that you were able to get here safely today is because in the transportation industry, we have an agency that's totally independent of the government called the NTSB. And they do root cause analysis whenever there's an issue, even if there's just a near miss. If two planes get too close to each other in the sky, but there is no tragedy, they do an investigation. They parse it out, they figure out, and it's not about blaming any one individual, it's not about, they look at the system and figure out how did that happen and how do we prevent it from happening in the future. They do the same type of investigatory processes in medicine. When there's an accident in a surgery, somebody was supposed to get their left elbow fixed and they do surgery on the right elbow. They do a sentinel event review, what's called a sentinel event review, which is a root cause analysis. They get everybody together that was involved. They sit around a table. It's not about blaming, it's about figuring out what went wrong and how do we fix it. Now, that exposes gaps in the system, that exposes errors, but people who work in those industries are happy to participate in those things, as uncomfortable as they might be, because everybody's focus is that the end result is that it doesn't happen again, or that they avoid the tragedy again. We have nothing like that in law enforcement. We're at the 1-year anniversary, I think, of the Uvalde massacre, and there was clearly a lot of problems with that, and we know nothing about it. How's that possible?
You know, you mentioned accountability, but he did this little segue into transparency. And I've talked to one of the reporters on the scene from NBC, and there's so much to what happened at Uvalde, which has not been publicly disclosed. And my question then to you is that this type of root cause analysis, and I've worked for a number of different oversight agencies, and one, we specifically were chartered to do that kind of work. I was in a lot of shooting scenes, I've seen a lot, but doing that kind of analysis is really important. But the important thing, though, is what is done with that report. Is there an expectation that that kind of root cause analysis is then made public?
Absolutely, because, and they do this, again, as I said, look at NTSB. Their reports go out, they're publicized, they are published in, if they're aeronautical in nature, they're published in the professional aeronautical magazines and journals so that other pilots can look and see. There was a near miss at LaGuardia Airport. No, I shouldn't even said that. I got
Hey.
Sorry.
You know, I'm
Sorry.
running out every week.
But like, yes, and that, like, here's the aircraft, and here's what happened, and here's what the pilot did, and here's what the other pilot did, and this is how either there was, something bad happened or something didn't happen. They want people to know. They do the same thing in medicine.
Right. But Tiffany, anything like that happened in Tulsa? Has there been any public, actual, official reporting of trustworthy reporting as to what happened that day to your brother?
Not at all. And really great response. I just haven't seen accountability at all. When Terence was shot, when we talk about accountability, it's not just the police officer himself or herself, it's all of the vestiges, that's attached to it. So when Terence was shot, the police spokeswoman with Tulsa Police Department came out the gate controlling the narrative, stating that he was belligerent and he wasn't complying and he wasn't following commands. And we pushed for the release of the video, and it was quite the opposite. She wasn't held accountable. Witnesses were turned away at the scene. The homicide detective stated that in his testimony. No one was held accountable. The homicide detective, teamed up with the DA and said, hey, look at his background. He's on drugs. Let's not go this route. Let's not, file these charges without even doing a proper investigation. And this is what the DA told me. No accountability because they're policing themselves. When we got into the courtroom, the judges, they were all on the same side. So there are so many layers that we have to look at when it comes to accountability, all the way up to the Fraternal Order of Police, the state politicians, the federal government. I've been at every layer trying to figure out how we advance policy to put accountability mechanisms in place, and we come against roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. So Betty Shelby was acquitted. She was granted back pay. She got her record expunged. She was able to teach law enforcement across the country on how to survive a critical incident, how to survive the aftermath of a critical incident. And then she was such a good shot that the NRA hired her to shoot a handgun class. Where's the accountability there? And so, no, to answer your question, no accountability at all.
So I want to take that. We hear what Sean talked about these after-action reports. Nothing like that happened in Tulsa. Deborah, I'm going to turn to you now. In Chicago, I'm not going to go through all the different layers of oversight there are in Chicago. I want to focus, though, on transparency and critical incident reporting. I'd let you take any example you want, but there's one in my mind in particular where Chicago police raided the wrong apartment and humiliated a woman who was there. Your office did after-action reporting on it, and my question to you ultimately, was that report transparent? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think the relationship between transparency and accountability is such an important one. Nobody is accountable in the dark, and so those things have to go together. And Chicago has certainly had struggles with both pieces of that pairing, both transparency and accountability. And there have been a number of very high-profile, very painful incidents over the last number of years that have really laid that bare. And the one you mentioned is certainly one of them. There was for those of you not familiar with the incident, there was the execution of a residential search warrant at a home on the basis of information provided by a confidential informant. The police went to the address that was listed on the warrant. That address, however, was not the residence of the target of the search warrant. It was the residence of a completely unaffiliated, unrelated social worker who was home by herself, changing her clothes when the police knocked down her door. So there have been layers of review of that incident, and in some ways, I think it's the opposite problem which leads to the same result. There's this expression we use that the appearance of oversight is worse than no oversight at all. And I don't know whether it's worse, but it's not a whole lot better in any event, because there is sort of this illusion of opportunity for progress and reflection and change. And when that doesn't happen, then what we end up with is all the problems we started out with, but now we have a landscape that's sort of littered with broken promises and missed opportunities for change and so on. That's not better. So with this particular incident, our office was one of a number of entities doing some work following that, both on the specific incident and its aftermath and its handling, but also on the kind of policy and training failures that led to circumstance and ones like it. And actually, we're still a little bit in the midst of some of that, so there's more to come. But I think this is a very lengthy way around to actually answering your question, Walter, so apologies. The trial lawyer in me. There was a really important sort of failure of transparency in the city's work following this incident, and that is that one of the reports, one of the efforts that was done at kind of after-action analysis was conducted by the office of the mayor under the cone of attorney-client privilege. And so there was a sort of much vaunted effort on the part of the city to examine the incident for purposes of accountability, and then there was no public accounting.
And that happens too frequently. Now, Mark, I'm going to turn to you now on this question of accountability. And I'm not going to attribute this to you because it wouldn't be fair to, but I'm on Twitter about police accountability issues, and like over the last week, this one law enforcement guy responded to something I put up who said that accountability is a code word for throwing officers under the bus. Now, what is it with this sometimes reflexive hostility that one gets from law enforcement when it comes to something as simple as accountability. And I want to point out the irony. These are folks which every single day that they go out there and expect to hold individuals in society accountable for the smallest transgressions.
Well, first let me translate what he was actually saying and then show you how I agree with him. Because accountability, when you're talking about police agencies, is really the application of the stick. You have the carrot and the stick. And until you get to the point where you apply the stick to law enforcement, you get nowhere. You can examine it, you can set up panels, you can have discussions, you can have everything, but until there is the application of the stick, as that guy was saying, throw him under the bus, because that's his own personal interpretation of it, but no, it's not throwing under the bus, it's applying a penalty to bad behavior. Cops don't move unless you either do one or two things. You either incentivize or you penalize. There's no in between. So while you engage in examination, I think there should always be examination of incidents. I think you should always have these post-incident analysis. I think you should always engage in ways in which to improve our operations, et cetera. But the bottom line is, nothing fixes bad behavior like a severe penalty. And it also sends a message to all those in the profession, if you do that, you get this. We have to begin the process of dumbing it down to a level where everybody can get it. And so accountability for me is just application stick, and you will see miraculously everything kind of switches and turns around when people feel their livelihoods, their freedom is at stake for real, and it really will go away if you engage in that behavior. And that officer, Betty, what's her name? There would be a different dynamic. But as it stands right now, while we put together panels and we debate the integrity of law enforcement and policing, et cetera, there are actual criminals getting away with it, playing the system, while we are hesitant to fully apply the stick.
Yeah, I'm actually, thank you for that. I'm actually convinced that had in Minneapolis Derek Chauvin been held responsible for the excessive force that he engaged in, including treating a 14-year-old boy, he responded to a call for service in a house, very similar to how he treated George Floyd, that had his misconduct been taken seriously, that George Floyd would be alive.
Yeah, and also the other officers around him,
yeah,
and perhaps across the nation would see the penalty for such conduct.
That's right.
It's got to be public.
Right.
It's got to be broadcast. It's got to be wide-based. It's got to be clear and evident, because cops don't change any other way. It's either penalized or incentivized. That's the only thing they understand.
Yeah, I'm not going to go down the transparency rabbit hole where states like in California, where misconduct findings are generally secret, confidential information, so there's no such public accounting. Heather, I'm going to turn to you now and broaden and pull back on what we mean by accountability. We're mainly talking so far about this misconduct or excessive force, going to the wrong house after action reports, but accountability to community, at least, and we've been talking about this, I think can mean something bigger than that, should mean something bigger than that. And it's not just individual accountability, it's also organizational accountability. It's how do police do their expected jobs of maintaining safety and solving crimes. So let's talk about the latter, because you've focused on this thing called clearance rates, or ratio percentage of crimes which are solved by the police. But you've also taken a look at how are Black and brown victims and survivors treated by the police. And I even talked to you, Tiffany, about how you were treated afterwards. Let's focus on Baltimore and the reporting you've done to talk a little bit about that kind of accountability.
Sure. So I mentioned a little bit of the background of our assessment through the PSP program that was really about listening to stakeholders on the front lines of violence in a lot of different roles. And our very dense report, which I'm happy to make available to anyone, is just filled with findings and recommendations across 91 pages. But an overall theme is that so often Black and brown victims were more likely to be criminalized in the aftermath of violence than treated as survivors deserving of dignity and support. And the first chapter of this report, and a really important finding, and something that's been resonating for me throughout today around reckoning and reconciliation, the first finding about why this continues to happen with such frequency has to do with the pervasive and enduring role of racism. And we have to grapple with that. And the way in which the muscle memory of the system fosters this deeply rooted bias that certain types of violence and Black and brown bodies are less deserving of dignity and support than white victims and other forms of violence. And it's part of why if we were hyper-focused on those who are so often most harmed yet least helped by our infrastructure of support, Black and brown victims of gun violence. And to get more specific about all the different contexts that this showed up in our interviews, crime scenes, just being able to provide, basic information and dignity in a trauma-informed way, coercion and misinformation in the context of investigating cases. So everything from, offering resources or talking about the existence of victim compensation, for example, as a way to coerce information without appropriately managing expectations about when and how those resources would be available. Barriers to emergency relocation based on factors of worthiness. And another one, so midway through our assessment, we were already gathering a lot of information around the treatment of victims of gun violence in hospital settings. So property being confiscated, people being restrained to beds, having their visitors refused, getting threatened in real time for parole and probation violations as a way to extract investigatory information. All of this happening frequently in ways that were interfering with access to life-saving medical care. And midway through our assessment, a groundbreaking class action civil rights lawsuit was filed in Baltimore, laying out the 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendment rights violations that are happening on such a regular basis that we were learning so much about as well. And one of the things that was really striking about this, when we think about systemic accountability and all these pieces come together, at the time that lawsuit was filed, we were already 4 years at that time into the consent decree. And in addition to these really specific examples of unconstitutional policing that were being alleged, we were talking about just this profound corrosive effect with these practices and the relationship between police and community and the direct relationship to being able to solve cases. And in the consent decree, in addition to all the things that need to be adhered to about constitutional policing, there's also a commitment to problem-solving principles. Yet we were hearing throughout our interviews, whether it be the hospital-based violence intervention programs, other community-based victim service providers and advocates saying, we've been coming to the department for years trying to problem solve around this. We did not want this to escalate into a class action civil rights lawsuit. So there were so many just missed opportunities. And to tie it back to your question and clearance rates, I think one of the more striking findings of this is the disconnect when we conducted the interviews with law enforcement of various ranks and roles about why there was so many walls between communication and the lack of ability to work with the community in the aftermath of violent crime. So often there was kind of an oversimplified offering about the role of quote unquote stop snitching culture. It's like, no one will talk to us, there's this us and them, and it's really hard, and we're out here trying to solve cases. Whereas from a lot of the service providers who were kind of trying to heal and help meet people's needs in the aftermath of trauma, they were giving this much more nuanced explanation about all the reasons why it was not pragmatic to communicate with and participate in an investigative process that could not deliver on their safety, either physically or emotionally. And so our report is chock full of all these recommendations in a very practical way about how you provide those resources to create the safety that people need physically and emotionally to trust and communicate with these systems, whereas so much of the status quo was undermining public safety, undermining the legitimacy of the system.
Heather, thank you. And that was really powerful. And it's a great report. Okay, it's dense, whatever. It's so important, and I really recommend reading that. So, time is here and going really, really fast. And I could go for 3 hours with all of you. I'm already thinking of maybe I should create a podcast. You guys are each of my first 5 guests. Stay tuned. But I want to talk about impact and how to make impact, because all of you are doing it in certain specific ways. So for people out there thinking about, or like Tiffany in Tulsa, saying, I want more accountability in my city, or I want to have some form of a civilian oversight structure, be it an inspector general or some sort of independent monitor, or I'm going to go to the report that your firm just created on a call for renewal. Is that what it's called?
A renewed call to action.
Okay, yes, thank you. I passed that test. Not really. In it, you write, I'm going to attribute to you, Sean. The question is whether the U.S. has the will to end toxic conditions and policy choices that the Kerner Commission in the early 1970s found fuel police aggression and community despair. The answer, 55 years after their report, likely remains no. Now that's incredibly pessimistic, okay? And so I want to figure out a way so that all of us can talk about how we view how to make impact, either through the lens of the work that we're doing, so folks out there who want their call to action, with insights they can take away with that. So Marq, I'm gonna start with you, with your experience and your work with policing. You know policing culture here better than anybody. How do we change this?
Well, one is that we communicate honestly with what it is and what we're trying to accomplish. And then we have to really get with like-minded individuals who are really committed to working beyond what is commonly referred to as reform. If we want to transform, we want to deconstruct and reconstruct, whatever it is, get with like-minded individuals who are really, truly interested in making significant change. But we have to have honest discussions about, especially the role that race plays in policing and law enforcement and justice. It cannot be ignored or even denied, really, honestly, at this point. So I think that's the key component. And what we do in my organization and many organizations, law enforcement, especially some of the minority, quote-unquote, minority law enforcement organizations do, is provide information, real, street-level, honest, open information about the inner workings of our respective agencies, so that you would have an opportunity to find out what really happens beyond the press release and the press statement and the fancy conversation that's oftentimes had. So we provide ourselves as a resource that people can tap into when you want to know the real, because everything else is window dressing. And then finally, it goes back to my last statement, and that is, if you want any significant or substantive change, you have to have people fully accountable, and that in law enforcement, a justice system, means that people are penalized publicly.
Thank you. Deborah, earlier today we heard Representative Jeffries with a great quote, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And from your role as Inspector General, your office has been shining sunlight on a lot of the darker corners of city government and policing. How does that translate into making impact? If you want to ignore that question, take your own impact question, go for it.
No. Well, thanks for the invitation. I might have anyway. I think, I think that does really go to what I think the answer is to the impact question, or some version of it. We're not going to get anywhere from where we are with more of what doesn't work. And certainly in Chicago and everywhere, more of what we have had, more of where we have been isn't going to get us very far. If oversight agencies like mine are to have any impact here, it will be by taking a different approach than has been taken historically. Police oversight, civilian oversight of law enforcement is not new. It's not new in Chicago. It's not new across the country. But we have to do it in a new way. And I think that the way to do that, from my perspective, where the transparency work we do really is part of the answer, is to recognize that these are ecosystem problems that need ecosystem solutions. So the problems facing public safety, where policing is one component but not all of that landscape, and the criminal justice system, and deficits in social services, et cetera, those are ecosystem problems. Working within the four corners of any one agency or entity on that landscape doesn't get us there. And so I think if we are to have an impact in oversight, it is by recognizing that we need broad-reaching solutions, and that the way we get there is through interdisciplinary oversight, where we are looking at individual acts of misconduct and system failures and gaps in information transparency and data access, and that by taking that kind of integrative oversight approach to what is an ecosystem problem, that's the way forward if we are to have any impact here.
So your office can say, we've identified a problem, we can identify how the problem came about, and here are recommendations for how to fix it. But your office is not the implementer, not the executor. That falls on the mayor's office or the police department or the city council to do something. So if they don't, where are the levers?
Yeah, we're an ecosystem too. And I think that Chicago has a very crowded police oversight landscape, frankly. There's an awful lot of work to be done, but the reality is that there are a lot of players on that field. And the way to do that, the way to get things implemented, is by all of the entities, all the players on that field, working effectively together, playing their positions and playing to institutional strengths, so that exactly that happens. So that when we make fact findings, we make policy recommendations, and then the implementers, then the decision makers, sort of carry those things forward. And we have individual accountability when they don't do so.
Thanks. Tiffany, I'm going to get to you last. Okay, so I'm going to skip you for right now. Heather, your position at the center is super intriguing to me, because you're not in government, but you have this outside-in observate perch. How are you using that to make the impact in Baltimore that you're seeking?
Yeah, so we really view our role as to be of service to community-driven efforts, like here to provide institutional resources, convening power, things to support, but really have that to continue to be led by directly impacted community members. Thank you. And the convening function has been really key to that. So I'll give you an example of where our centers really tried to step into what we saw as a real gap on accountability measures. I'm sure many in this room are probably familiar with the gun trace task force scandal in Baltimore, which really just rocked not just Baltimore, but many communities throughout the country as just one of the most jaw-dropping recent examples of police corruption. And we now have, I think just last week, a dashboard was just launched to keep a tally of all the payouts in settlements to victims of the gun trace task force. The point being, this is not history, this is present, and it's very much part of what we need to be reckoning with. Those revelations came out in 2017, but it took until 2022 for the city to invest in and complete a thorough, independent investigation on the causes and consequences of how this level of corruption could happen and how to prevent it from ever happening again. That is a 660-page report that, while full of incredibly important findings and information for the path forward, is really inaccessible to the community. I mean, that's overwhelming to even us who in our day jobs are honed in on this work. So our center, as an example, has convened, and now we've done this twice, we're gonna just keep doing this as long as we need to, a community dialogue to give community members access to the commissioner, access to the authors of the report, access to the implementers of change on what kind of progress we're making, and can we measure it. Because one thing that has happened in Baltimore, and I know has happened in other cities, is that the police department often in findings like this says, yes, we agree, and we're on it. Don't worry, we're already fixing it. And that makes it really hard to kind of follow up and measure what that accountability means, and can the communities that have experienced the harms of policing feel the difference in their lives? But that takes resources. It takes relentless follow-up, and our center is trying to support that.
Thank you. Sean, you're the regulator here on the panel, right? You're the one person on this panel who currently has some ability to make a difference. In your early comments, I totally co-sign. We at Arnold Ventures, we do a lot of work in policy and advocacy and research and police accountability, and we identify the state level is probably one of the best levers for policy change. And in fact, narrowing it down further, we look at post-peace officer stands and training boards, as like the ILE-STB, as being a perfect vehicle for which to actually regulate a profession which for centuries has not acted like a regulated profession. So tell us how, either from that perch or at 21 CP, what are levers you can pull?
Well, first of all, you've given me way more power than I really actually have.
I'll give you whatever you need, Sean.
But thank you. So I think it's this. First of all, and let me back up just a little bit, because there's a lot of, I feel a lot of pessimism on some of our answers. But the reality is, you started this conversation by asking the question, what has changed? And the answer is not enough, but a lot, but not all of it has been good. And so I think I'm optimistic because my state has taken that step. And more than that step, and I think state legislation is really a key fulcrum point, and people should be focusing on that. Right now in the state of Illinois, if an officer is involved in a shooting or another deadly use of force, or use of force that results in serious bodily harm, an outside agency has to come in and review that, not the officer's department. And in my state now, the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board has to accept all complaints, whether they're leveled anonymously or not. Every law enforcement agency that receives a complaint of serious misconduct has to report that to the board, and the board then can track their investigation. And when their investigation's concluded, they have to send it to the board for the board to review and make sure that they actually did a legitimate, good investigation. If they didn't, the board can investigate it themselves, and so on. There's a lot of things happening, and we're not the only state doing this. There's a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of cause for, I think, optimism. But in terms of the levers that we can pull, one, we can be a model for other states. We can also be an instructive model for state legislatures. It's not all like roses and butterflies and unicorns flying around and stuff. I mean, I'll be perfectly frank with you. We got the authority to do this last January 1st. We are just now starting to schedule decertification hearings now, and that's because we didn't have the infrastructure in place when the legislature gave us that authority. We had to hire people. We still got to hire people. We need to hire about 30 or 40 people to staff our agency. We had to get the governor to appoint people to a review board. We had to get the attorney general to appoint people to a review board. We didn't have a review board up until a couple weeks ago, fully appointed. So, these things don't happen overnight, but I think the system is a good one. It's just, you got to make sure that you've got the funding for it, because legislators, they'll pass all kinds of stuff, but they also don't always appropriate the money to make it happen. So you got to make sure you have the money for it, and you got to make sure that you have the infrastructure to do the job. And if you have those things, you can do the job. And I think we've got a pretty good system ready to go.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Tiffany, you're surrounded by all these folks who have been doing this for a long time, and I know from our conversations from here today that, you truly, and I agree, feel that not enough is happening in Tulsa. There's too much resistance. How are you planning to make an impact, and how can we help you?
Thank you so much. And I do think that we use this word impact loosely. Do we truly understand what that word means? And is our work truly making an impact? And when I define what impact means, it means one object colliding with another object and disrupting something. And so we have to disrupt something. You know, I'm listening to all of the systems actors. Can we truly imagine a world without police, without prisons if we closed our eyes? Can we do that? And I ask people, and I got this from my brother Jay Jordan, he always asks us to close our eyes and imagine a time throughout our life where we felt most safe. What did it smell like? What did it look like? And if you were to answer that question, you would probably say, I was with my grandmother. I was with my family on Thanksgiving. I smelled turkey and dressing. I was playing at the park. I was at the beach. You will not hear one person say police. And so when we talk about public safety, you know, to me, we have to really reframe if we're going to change and do things different. To me, public safety is associated with police, prisons, and punishment. Let's start to shift our thinking to community safety, where communities have the autonomy and the agency to determine what safety looks like for them, you know, what happiness looks like for them. And so we're afraid of this word abolish the police, but when I read the Declaration of Independence, and can I just read one little paragraph before I shut up? I just want you all just let me read this, Walter. We hold these truths, just the first paragraph, to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these things are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. And so we're afraid of this word, but it is right there, smack dab in the middle of the Declaration of Independence. And if we're gonna do things differently, we have to shift our thinking and really imagine a world free from punishment, prisons, police, and harm. And the world I imagine and I envision for little Terence Jr., he has a little boy who's 10 years old. I imagine Terence Jr. being able to walk outside free. And I imagine him being able to play in a park with a toy gun and not be killed, Tamir Rice. I imagine Terence being able to get his driver's license at the age of 16 and not be pulled over and killed Philando Castile because of a broken tail light. In my mind, I imagine Terence being able to sit on his sofa and eat a bowl of ice cream and not be killed in his own home, Botham John. And I imagine a world where Terence can play video games with me, his aunt, and not be killed through a window, a Tatiana Jefferson. That is the world I imagine and I envision, not just for Terence Jr., but for Black and brown kids and people all across this country. Can you imagine a world that's safe, where resources are shared and abundant, and neighbors know one another? That's what I want to see. That is my generational vision for justice and liberation.
You know, Tiffany, it's been 9 years since Michael Brown. It's been 8 years since Walter Scott was gunned down in South Carolina. It's been 7 years since Philando Castile was killed in Minnesota. And I think the vision that we share is that if your brother had a problem with his car in the middle of the road that day, that somebody would have come up to him and said, "How can I help you?" And that's all that it would have taken.
That's all I want.
Right, I understand. All right, this has been an amazing conversation with all of you. So we went a little bit over time. Sorry, Lorenzo. I did see your time checks. I think we've got about 8 or 9 minutes open for questioning. So let's continue this. Yes, sir, in back.
Hi, my name is Arnold Ventures. I'm from Equal Justice USA. I lead a program called Trauma to Trust.
Yep.
We bring community members and the police officers in the same room to work towards healing, acknowledging trauma to build shared understanding and create trauma-informed tactics in the community. I speak from a place of reality. My cousin was killed by cops, so I empathize with you completely. One of the things that I hear in this conversation, or I didn't hear in this conversation, is the word empathy. And part of my challenge when we work with law enforcement is that community members can lend empathy to law enforcement and say, wow, you guys have a tough job. You're dodging this, that, and the third. But when it comes down to building trust, empathy is a building block for building trust. And law enforcement struggles in lending that same empathy to people who've been marginalized or oppressed by a system. Part of that issue is because the system, the institution, is built on a sense of, going back to that issue of implicit bias. If I lend empathy to someone that I think can kill me, someone that I see as less than, I'm either showing up as weak or I'm not going to be able to get home, which is a policy issue. If you're being trained on hours of use of force, but you aren't trained on how to de-escalate, aren't trained on how to have communication, aren't trained to recognize the person as the person that you're working alongside, then there's always going to be a disconnect. So my question is, how do we, or what do you propose as policy changes to be able to infuse the necessary component of empathy for law enforcement as they work alongside community members that have been oppressed?
Heather?
I can start. Thank you for that. It's so important. And there was actually a chapter in our report called Empathy as a Requirement. And part of what it spoke to was finding that there was sort of this false distinction that the skill set that officers needed to be a good investigator was somehow distinct from those needed to be an effective community liaison. And part of what we were trying to do was sort of break down that dichotomy and try to help understand why it was important for everyone to have these skills and the role that trauma played. And so understanding people who were in the direct aftermath of victimization, that was obviously a really important part of it. But another hugely important part of it that I think we're talking about more, but still not talking about nearly enough, is all of the unaddressed trauma within law enforcement and the ways that that was erecting barriers to being able to see other people's humanity as a self-protective measure. And so we offered in the report, some really key things to try to get law enforcement officers the resources they need, but those are only going to be so effective if we don't change the culture that makes it supportive and encouraging to recognizing those needs. And I'm sure others have thoughts on this.
Well, I'm going to go on to more questions since we do have limited time. So any other question? Yes, hi.
My name's Rebecca Engel. I teach here at John Jay, and I also used to work for the Inspector General here in New York City. And I see some of my former colleagues in the crowd. So this is only representing my views, so just to be clear. I'm an attorney by training, so let's put aside the legal arguments for a second and think if Inspector Generals or places like the CCRB, which deals with individual officers here in New York City, actually had the power to punish. But getting back to what Officer Katz referred to as to apply the stick. Or for OIG and YPD actually said, this is our recommendation, you cannot blow them off because you don't like them. Would that make a difference? Because I find that to be one of the biggest gaping holes within accountability structures currently, is that there is accountability, but at the end of the day, the decision lies elsewhere.
You want to take that, Deborah?
I do.
Yes.
I think that is really the crux of the challenge. And I think that there are some things to be balanced here. On one hand, there is this problematic disjointing between oversight entities and the enforcement power, right? The levers. On the other hand, that is precisely a hallmark of the sort of independence that makes outside oversight meaningful. And so if you put the enforcement power in the hands of the oversight body, that is not exactly independent from the system. That's much more functionally part of the system. And so I think what matters is that we have, these are, again, back to the ecosystem observation, what matters is that we have an ecosystem that effectively carries out both disciplinary and policy recommendations. Whether that's the same agency is not, in my mind, actually the sort of threshold question, but whether the system as a whole is equipped to do that in a competent and transparent and accountable way.
Thank you. Very back row. Yes, hi.
My name is Erica. Thank you all for your comments and advice and wisdom today. I'm so glad that my sister in the middle was talking about abolition because I was sitting here and thinking, wow, I might be the minority in this audience, so I thank you for bringing it up. And I just wanted to know what your co-panelists thought about it, because we're sitting here talking about reform and all of these methods and defund or divest. And at the end of the day, policing, the history of policing is ultimately racist. It exists within a racist system. And therefore, if we keep just saying, okay, let's keep putting Band-Aids over it, let's paint over the mold, at the end of the day, the mold is still there. So it seems to me, and I'm coming from, I have a degree in criminal justice. Actually, it's funny being here because I did apply to John Jay, ended up going to University of New Haven. I was working in the district attorney's office, Suffolk County, Boston, as a victim advocate. So I've worked with officers, good cops, quote unquote, and bad cops, worked with community, worked with judges. So I'm very familiar with the whole system as a whole, and I was there through Mike Brown and all of these different police shootings that were happening and what we're living today. At the end of the day, I'm like, okay, we've tried all of these different solutions, all of these different Band-Aids, as I put it earlier, and we're still left at the same place. And so to me, the only thing is to tear it all down and start over. So I just want to hear from the other panelists what your thoughts are on abolition.
Well, killer question. I got the wrap-up sign, so we're going to honor that and answer your question. And actually, let me take a crack at that myself. Who wants to volunteer for that one? Because I think that's a really important question.
I'll take it.
Okay, go for it.
Unpredictably. I do not support complete abolition of police. And I will support that when there is a complete abolition of those elements in our society who eliminate, if there's less danger in those people in our society who are operating outside of quote unquote societal norms and law and order, if they are eliminated and abolished, then I would support an abolition of police. I do support fully shifting police away from this very stale, outdated policing model and more towards a public safety model. I also firmly believe that police shouldn't be engaged in enforcement of probably about half the stuff that they do enforce. So whereas I'm not, and of course there's a bias, I got a pension from police department with a retired detective, but I don't support the abolition of police because that doesn't mean that those people who are dangerous out there all of a sudden disappear and I can live in this kind of, beautiful world. I'd love that, but I think that there is still a need as long as there are individuals who will operate outside of societal norms and represent some level of danger.
Heather, yeah.
I really appreciate the question, and I will say and go on record that I think we are doing way too much tinkering in the reform space and pouring too much effort into things that are not just not delivering on the transformational change that this requires, but that sometimes inadvertently and sometimes intentionally prop up and legitimize a very harmful status quo. And one thing I've really been struggling with in Baltimore, we're 7 years into a consent decree now that poured so much resource and has asked for faith from the community for so long without translating that into changes that can be felt in people's lives. And every consent decree hearing starts with this lament that the biggest challenge to change sought under the decree are staffing levels. And like, if we can't keep up the staffing in a city that spends nearly as much per capita on policing than any city in the entire country, I think that's hiding the ball from the really hard questions of the work. Like, how do we reduce the footprint of policing where there is widespread agreement this is not an appropriate and often a very harmful response? So I don't think we're doing nearly enough to push toward that transformation.
Sean?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, not to push back. But actually, I think there is a lot of work we can do in terms of redefining the role that we want police to play. And, Baltimore, by the way, is probably, and we were talking about this at lunch, is probably the most effective consent decree to date, honestly. I mean, they've in terms of where they're at and where they've been, and the speed with which they're coming into compliance is light years, frankly, ahead of a place like Cleveland, who started several years before Baltimore did. We need to take a good, hard look and an honest look. And again, I don't want to get too pie in the sky here, but the fact of the matter is, we've touched all over this, but the fact of the matter really is, our country still is not comfortable talking about race and talking about a lot of the things that we heard in the last plenary session. And until we can do that, I think we're going to have a hard time fixing a lot of things. And so that's where I'm at on it.
Yeah. Tiffany or Deborah, you guys want to? No? Yeah.
I'll just say very quickly, and then I'll get out of the way. I think that from my perspective, the conversation to be having today, and maybe there's a different conversation tomorrow, but the conversation to be having today is about right-sizing the footprint of policing. It's about determining those tasks which belong with the police and which we, incidentally, equip and train them to get good outcomes at doing. And then there are those functions which belong elsewhere. They belong with social service practitioners and others better equipped to do them. That's a dynamic calculation. We should be changing, we should be examining and adjusting that footprint as we go, and making sure that all of those institutions, the ones in uniforms with badges and the other agencies, the other providers as well, are equipped to succeed at the functions we've allocated to them. And that should change over time. And I think that if we found ourselves in a world where more and more of those safety and care functions found well-equipped, competent homes outside police departments, with professionals who were trained to succeed at providing those services, I think that would be a safer and more just world in which to live.
By the
Thank
way,
you.
if
Yeah.
I could real quick,
Yeah.
by the way, we are at a transition point right now. We have an incredible opportunity right now to have these conversations and make these kinds of changes. And by the way, to have a real impact on changing the culture of policing, period. And it's because of something that you mentioned, which starts at the front of every consent decree hearing in Baltimore, but is the first topic that everybody needs to be talking about, or I shouldn't say needs to be, but that everybody is talking about in every police department in the United States. And that is the record low staffing levels. This is an opportunity, folks.
Right.
This is an opportunity to inject people into this profession that never would have considered it before. This is also an opportunity for us to do some redefinition, because the fact of the matter is, I say that a lot, don't I? The fact of the matter is, we don't have the manpower to continue doing all the things we do in all the different places that we do them in terms of policing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, now's the time.
Yeah, it's a remarkable opportunity. I'll finish up, Tiffany, unless you have something else you want to add.
We just need more investment in communities.
Yep.
If you invest in housing, maybe we won't need to criminalize homelessness.
Yeah.
If you invest in education, maybe, we won't have children, being hyper-disciplined or exposed. If you just put street lights in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
that drives down crime. Maybe we won't have to call the police. So I think we do need massive investment in communities, and we need to make sure that basic needs are met.
Yeah, we've engaged in some trade-offs here, and we've allowed those trade-offs to become permanent, and that's a challenge. And so, I think there are things that we could consider abolishing, right? We could abolish street teams, right? I mean, when I was still a public defender back in the early 2000s, the Rampart crash scandal at LAPD was the big story. Here was playing cars, uniformed street team, which is creating all sorts of abuses. We knew street teams were a problem then. We knew street teams are a problem in Baltimore with the gun trace task force. And then somehow Tyree Nichols gets murdered in Memphis by the Scorpion team and everyone acts shocked. We don't need them. Get rid of them. That's just one thing we could abolish. We can start the conversation there. We could talk about traffic stops and ask, okay, we can understand traffic stops are DUI, running a red light, speeding, traffic safety reasons, but do young people need to be stopped because they have a pine cone air freshener hanging from their pine tree air freshener? I don't think so. So I think there's some questions we should be asking while recognizing the fact that we are in a country with more than 300 million handguns in circulation and 300 million firearms. So wow, time's over. Sorry I couldn't take your questions. Thank you, Marq, Deborah, Tiffany, Heather, Sean. You guys were fantastic.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so
Thank
much
you
for
very
being here. Thank you.